Sony Interactive Entertainment is often praised for their suite of worldwide studios that are all across the planet, these great developers making awesome games that are only available on PlayStation. That's all well and good, but now let's talk about the ones that are no longer with us. So not too long ago, I did a video already on Sony's worldwide studios, the ones that they currently have right now that are in operation. We went over when they started, their history, some of the games that they're most notable for, and what they're currently working on. Well, this is going to be kind of like the same thing, except these are studios that have been closed or Sony's moved on from, a good history lesson, why they've closed, things like that. A Sony graveyard, if you will, which is unfortunate. It always sucks when Sony has to close a developer. It sucks when any developer has to close. It sucks when people lose their jobs. It's all bad stuff. But without further ado, let's get started, and we will start with 989 Studios. Now, they were founded in 1995 based in Foster City, California, and they weren't actually called 989 Studios until 1998. They were originally formed from Sony ImageSoft and the SCEA development branch and called Sony Interactive Studios America. 989 Studios worked on a number of games ranging from Cool Borders, Twisted Metal, Siphon Filter, and a few others. The studio also actually worked on EverQuest, but the team focusing on that broke off and formed their own independent studio, Variant Interactive, in 1999. And that studio was also later acquired by Sony Online Entertainment, and we'll touch on them later. By the year 2000, 989 Studios was now mostly focusing on releasing games under the 989 Sports brand, and they were releasing a lot of games for the PlayStation 2. 2005 was the final round of sports games released under the 989 label, as Sony started focusing strictly on MLB The Show, and that was developed by San Diego Studios, so essentially they became entirely unnecessary. Now, I said we'd touch on Sony Online Entertainment, and we'll jump into them right now, and they were actually formed in 1997, and SOE actually began as a Sony subsidiary. They acquired developer Variant Interactive, like I mentioned, in June 2000. That was the team responsible for EverQuest, and EverQuest did incredibly well. It was well received, and they supported the game for the years that followed. Up until around April 2006, Sony Online Entertainment then became an LLC, but they were still owned by Sony Computer Entertainment, but they were a bit more independent in this regard. After that, SOE released a number of games for Windows and PlayStation, but because of this, they were never technically considered part of Sony Worldwide Studios. By February 2015, Sony announced that they actually sold SOE to an investment company, and the developer was then renamed to Daybreak Game Company. And they do in fact still exist today. That was just a matter of Sony offloading them, more or less. Now, we'll get into one that's a bit of a soft spot for me, if I'm being honest, and we'll lump these two together because they kind of go together, but Evolution Studios and Big Big Studios. Now, Evolution was founded in 1999, and Big Big was formed in 2001. Big Big was actually started by former Codemaster developers with the help of Evolution Studios, so essentially Evolution was considered a parent company in this regard. Evolution created the World Rally Championship franchise on the PS2, and all those titles were published by Sony. This would make Evolution at the time being considered a second-party developer. In 2005, Big Big released their first game, Pursuit Force, on the PSP, which Sony did publish, and Evolution then began the MotorStorm franchise in 2006 on PS3, and then by September 2007, both Evolution and Big Big were acquired by Sony. In the following years, Evolution did more MotorStorm, while Big Big focused on Sony's portable space with games like MotorStorm Arctic Edge and Little Deviants. And Little Deviants was Big Big's last game, and they were closed almost immediately after release in January 2012, and this was mostly due to restructuring and removing redundancies in Sony's Worldwide Studios lineup. Evolution's last game was Drive Club, which suffered from a big delay and wasn't the total vision that the developer was aiming for up until a lot of subsequent patches and updates added more content. And then in 2015, the company suffered a lot of layoffs, totaling pretty much close to half of the staff, and the remaining half were to focus on Drive Club as a service, and then a year later, in 2016, the studio was completely shuttered. Now, what's really interesting about this is that most of the staff, after they left, actually Codemasters took a lot of them back in, and Codemasters allowed them to start their own project, have their own sort of creative vision, and that's when they did Onrush. And Onrush, unfortunately, didn't really perform all that well in terms of sales, and the layoffs hit that same team again, and only a few people were retained to work on the remaining Codemaster titles. This is again a situation where Sony cites redundancies for the closure and doesn't really go into the specifics. Now, going into Guerrilla Cambridge was formed in 1989, and this studio actually went through a number of names up until it was mostly just called Sony Computer Entertainment Europe Cambridge for most of its life. The studio was well known for Medieval on the PlayStation and PlayStation Portable, but they also developed Little Big Planet on the PSP and a few random PS2 games that you would never imagine, like 24 the game, which is odd. I feel like a lot of people probably don't know that. Now, in 2012, the studio was restructured to be a subsidiary of Guerrilla Games and were renamed to Guerrilla Cambric. And under this name, they did Killzone Mercenary on the Vita and Riggs on the PlayStation VR. They were closed fairly recently in January 2017 as part of a restructuring in Europe. And what's really disappointing here is that the studio was more or less put to work on two newly launched PlayStation hardware in Vita and PlayStation VR, and they weren't very likely to sell a lot of games to begin with. They were making these games to sell this hardware, so you'd have to imagine these games weren't going to perform incredibly well to begin with. I just feel like this studio didn't need to be closed and should have been given more time. Now, going into a really interesting one, you may not realize how this studio actually ended up going away, but Incognito Entertainment. They were founded in May 1999 by employees of Single Track, whom were contracted by Sony for several titles of games like Twisted Metal and the original Warhawk. Incognito was formed as a Sony subsidiary. Now, Incognito started out doing Twisted Metal spin-offs and sequels, but they're now mostly remembered for their 2007 release, Warhawk, on the PS3. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Incognito was never actually closed by Sony, it was more so disbanded. So, around 2007, a lot of the staff and the studio heads, Scott Campbell and David Jaffe, they went on to form their own studio, which was Eat, Sleep, Play, and then the remaining other members that were left at the staff and the new studio head Dylan Job at the time, they also left to form their own studio, Lightbox Interactive, in 2009. Lightbox Interactive continued to support Warhawk. They actually took responsibility for that because essentially there was no Incognito anymore. And they even went on to develop their spiritual successor, Starhawk. And that was actually Lightbox's only PlayStation game. That was a second-party game. Lightbox is considered independent, and they've actually moved on from consoles at this point. They've actually moved on to iOS and mobile software. Now moving on to SCE Liverpool. A lot of modern gamers or younger kids, they might just know them as Liverpool, but a lot of older gamers might actually remember them from their original name, Psygnosis. This developer has an incredibly long history making games, but what's interesting here is that they were acquired by Sony in 1993 and played a vital role in delivering some of the earliest PlayStation games. But Psygnosis still retained independence and continued to release multi-platform titles. This was to the point where Sony actually attempted to sell them in 1996, but after a bit of time, Sony pulled the offer to sell and kept them on board. In 2000 is when Psygnosis was fully brought into SCE Europe and changed their name to Studio Liverpool, now fully committing to PlayStation games. As Studio Liverpool, they're well known for the Formula 1 and the Wipeout franchise, most notably. In August 2012, Sony announced the Studio Liverpool would be closed due to a reassessment of Sony's European studios, and given the studio's immense history, this is a particularly disappointing closure. Though Sony does say that the Liverpool site is still in operation, and apparently some of the staff was still retained for XDev Studio. Either way, this was a really tough one to swallow. Which segues nicely into another very tough one, but Zipper Interactive. Zipper was formed in 1995, and they initially developed a lot of PC games until they released SOCOM for the PlayStation 2 in 2002. And Sony published the SOCOM series, so second-party developer, and Zipper continued to release a number of sequels, but by January 2006, Sony finally announced that they acquired the studio. Now, Zipper's last few games were SOCOM 4, MAG, and Unit 13, and Sony once again announced their closure immediately after their last release, which was Unit 13. And what's even worse is that this is despite the fact that the studio had 2 new games planned for PS4, a new IP, and another SOCOM entry. Sony cited resource realignment for this one. Again, this one it sucks because they had this developer had a long-term vision with 2 more games going basically, which kind of gives you this idea of like how much disparagement there can be at times where what the parent company wants to do and what this small portion of people have planned, and they're super excited and they think they've got jobs, and then sure enough, no they don't right after they ship a game on the PlayStation Vita, which again, a scenario where surely the game's not going to do all that well. Now, Zipper has had some hit or miss titles near the end of their life cycle prior to Unit 13, but still, talented team. I know they could have done more. That one really sucked. Here's what many people may not know about, which is Contrail. Contrail wasn't actually a developer, but they were a subsidiary formed in 1997 to oversee the development of second-party games released on the original PlayStation, so they can be credited with games like Wild Arms 2, The Legends of Legaia, just making sure that those games go smoothly and the development is all well and good. And by August 2007, the company was fully absorbed into Sony Computer Entertainment, so not necessarily closed. Everybody retained their jobs. The purpose of Contrail still existed. It was just a matter of like, why do we have to have this separate entity. We'll just do it under Sony Computer Entertainment. Here's another juicy one, perhaps the most mysterious on this list, and it's recent. SuperBot Entertainment. SuperBot was responsible for making PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Now, they were formed in 2009, and they were formed by Shannon Studstill and Chan Park, and they're big developers from Sony Santa Monica. The studio hired staff based on experience in the fighting genre to develop PlayStation All-Stars, and the game released in November 2012, and shortly after that, Sony confirmed that they cut ties with SuperBot, despite the fact that the studio was born out of Sony Santa Monica and Sony Computer Entertainment. So Sony made a studio and then just said, alright, well, you guys can go do your own thing. Which SuperBot, at the time, announced, yeah, we're still going to be a developer and we will do our own thing. And they did announce that they'd live on to do an unannounced project. And a lot of people don't know this, but they actually did do one thing in particular, which was a really small, weird education game for iOS and Android. And that was in 2013, so a year after PlayStation All-Stars. But as of today, there's no job listing, social media dead, the website's dead. No closure was ever actually announced, but the last time they actually gave an update was, oh yeah, we're still doing stuff. And sure enough, there's this... all signs of this company existing is now gone, so we only have to assume that the company actually is closed. Now, this is a rather quick one, but Team Soho, and this is another situation where this developer was actually born as a Sony subsidiary. They did a few games on PlayStation. They're most notable for the Getaway franchise and the PlayStation 2, and this was a scenario where the team was essentially absorbed into SCE London, and SCE London still exists today, so not necessarily a closure, but just removing the fact of having a separate team, and the staff was again absorbed into SCE London. Although you'd have to figure that's 16 years ago now, so I don't know if the same team still exists or whatever, but Sony still retains the rights to the Getaway franchise. They could do another Getaway. We all remember the Getaway sequel that was canceled on PS3, so that's kind of an interesting one that some people still hold out for today. But going into our last team, Team Ico. Another soft spot for some people in the world of PlayStation, so they were founded in 1997. Team Ico is well known for their critically acclaimed games, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, but the big one here, the big elephant in the room, was The Last Guardian. They were a part of Sony's Japan studio, and a lot of that closure has to deal with The Last Guardian, a game which was started by Team Ico, but was actually then finished by a new team, Gen Design. So this is when game director Fumito Ueda departed the team around 2011, and then several staff moved on and they formed Gen Design, and nobody really knew about this. This was all happening behind the scenes, but basically they took over development in 2014. So we're not sure about the real gap here of 2011 to 2014 in terms of how much Sony Japan Studio did on their own, or how much involvement Ueda had prior to forming the new team, or what have you. But essentially, Sony never announced the closure of Team Ico. It's just kind of assumed at that point that it was somewhere around 2011 when this transition happened from the Team Ico team to the Gen Design team. And Gen Design is an independent studio that Fumito Ueda runs himself. And that's it. So to sum up, most of them were closed, but a few of them were either sold off or Sony just didn't want anything to do with them. Some were disbanded and just basically abandoned more or less. And then some of them were just absorbed right back into Sony Computer Entertainment. Anyway, thank you for walking with me through this Sony graveyard and paying respects to every tombstone that we come across. I hope you've left some roses. It's sad, I know. I mean, really, what's super sad about it is that these were so many talented developers, and they had such a long history. Some of these were formed over 20 years ago. They released so many games, and it sucks. It's an unfortunate reality of the whole business is business thing, but that is the reality of it, is that business is business. So Sony Corporation makes these decisions based on a number of issues. It's a very complicated, multifaceted thing from a multi-billion-dollar corporation's perspective. They don't take these decisions lightly. They have to do what they have to do. It sucks, but again, what are you going to do? That's just the harsh nature of it. But yeah, and the thing is, you don't have to tell me, all right? I know how much I would love a MotorStorm on PlayStation 4. I was begging for these guys to do it after Drive Club, essentially. And I know Sony owns the MotorStorm IP. They can field it out to another developer. No, I don't want that. I want the Evolution guys to do it. They do a great rally racing game. So It's all, it's crazy. I almost have night terrors about it sometimes. I wake up in a panic, in sweat, that I will never get another MotorStorm game. And that is something that I have to live with. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates here on YouTube. And I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.